Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Dollar Dialogue. Today's episode is episode 64 Big Brothers of the State. Mr. Mao Zedong, Mr. Kemal Atatürk, and Mr. Otto von Bismarck, rest in peace. So, for today's episode, we have Mr. Rishan Ali, who is going to be talking about these three dictators and their influence politically, economically, and historically in the grand scheme of things. Mr. Rishan Ali is currently a IBTP Year One student at Charterhouse, England, and I believe this is his fourth time on today's podcast. And every time Mr. Rishan Ali comes, the viewers they want him back again. So today we have Mr. Rishan Ali for our penultimate episode before me and Shazib retire from the Dollar Dialogue podcast. So, Mr. Rishan Ali, is there anything else you'd like to add to the introduction?
No, I think you covered me very well. I'm very excited to be back, and I always love it here.
Thank you, Mr. Rishan Ali. So, viewers, this is Mr. Rishan Ali's fourth time on the podcast, and as they say, four times the charm, if I'm not mistaken. So, for today's episode, we will talk about three big brothers, Mr. Kamal Atatürk, Mao Zedong, and Otto von Bismarck, and these are leaders who didn't just govern countries but fundamentally re-engineered them. Each emerged in moments of crisis, and each believed the state had to be strong, not just an institution but as a guiding force shaping identity, economy, society itself. So, therefore, today's episode is very interesting because we are going to be analyzing the legacy that continues to define their nations even today. And in this episode, it's not just about history. We're going to be talking about power, politics, economic control, and the role of the state. Questions that remain deeply prevalent in today's world, especially in today's uncertain world for developing nations navigating growth, inequality, and political instability like Bangladesh. So for today's to start off, we will I would like to talk about Mr. Otto von Bismarck, and Mr. Otto von Bismarck is a German chancellor, and he was most famous in the early 19th century Europe, where he sort of led the reunification of Germany, and his contributions are still very noted in history today. So, firstly, when talking about Otto von Bismarck, I think it's sort of blasphemy to not include the Germany that was sort of before Otto von Bismarck and the Germany that was after Otto von Bismarck. So before Bismarck, essentially there was no Germany because instead you had 39 states loosely tied together in what was called the German Confederation after the Congress of Vienna, which I believe happened in around 1800s. And
Sorry, sorry, I'm really sorry to interrupt, but could I just say something about the Germany before that era, and then you can take over from the Confederation?
yes, yes, Dov. Yeah. So could you please talk about the Germany before Bismarck, Rishan Ali?
So, I mean, if we go all the way back to the Roman times, back then you had the Germanic tribes, and they were sort of barbarians. They were very fragmented, and they were these pagan tribes. So for hundreds of years, they were attacking Rome, sacking Roman cities, but they never really established anything concrete. All that continued until ultimately the Western Roman Empire fell, and then the Holy Roman Empire was formed much later. So that was basically made from Charlemagne. He was the leader of the Franks. So the Holy Roman Empire in the beginning stretched from France to the sort of past modern day Germany, incorporated Switzerland, and that eventually became Germany itself. And that eventually, over time, fragmented on and on. Napoleon invaded, broke up Germany, dissolved the Holy Roman Empire, which was also led by Austria at the time, which is another German state, which we don't really associate with Germany because Bismarck was unable to unify them. And so before Bismarck came in, the Germany that Napoleon had left was a bunch of these states, small states, mainly the Bavaria was the biggest, as well as Prussia. But they formed a confederation of the Rhine, which was mainly led by Austria, and an idea for German reunification was always being planned, but because Prussia and Austria were these two big competing powers, it was not never going to be possible to create a Germany with without excluding one of them because they would always be fighting. So I mean, now you can take over.
No, yeah, Dolph, I wholeheartedly agree with what you have said, and I mean, you couldn't have like explained it better. So yeah, so essentially, what viewers, what Mr. Rishan Ali said, prior to Mr. Otto von Bismarck, essentially there was no Germany, and I think Dolph mentioned it that there was also a growing force, which was sort of the nationalism at the time, and German nationalism to be specific, people who want unity. But essentially, what as Dolph mentioned, there was no clear path to achieve it. And before the podcast, I was looking into some of the historical attempts. So attempts at liberal unification, if I believe, happened during the 1850s in the Frankfurt Parliament, and it just failed miserably. And I believe the reasons were that there were too much debate and no military backing, and kings simply ignored them. So this failure was crucial because it proved that idealism without power achieves nothing. A lesson that I believe Bismarck internalized completely. So, firstly, to talk about Bismarck, who was he? So he was born in the early 1800s, early 19th century Europe, which was the same year as the Congress of Vienna, surprisingly. And his background was that he was a junker. So basically, he was a Prussian landowning aristocrat. And people often say that his personality was that he was ruthless, pragmatic, and incredibly intelligent, which are some of the personalities that we see in the other two big brothers later in the episode as well. So for Bismarck, his ideology wasn't just to create democracy. He wasn't trying to create equality either. He wanted a strong, unified Germany under Prussian dominance. And in order to do so, firstly, I believe it can be broken down into three phases. The first phase was utilizing war as a tool. So there were three wars of unification. The firstly, I would like to say like Bismarck didn't stumble into war. Idly, he designed them. So there was the Danish War, which was essentially about the control of apology for my pronunciation, Schleswig and Holstein, which were German-speaking territories under Danish rule. And the strategy was to basically team up with Austria, and as a result, Denmark was defeated due to the massive overwhelming military force, and territories of Germany were expanded. And this was basically a setup because after that we saw the Austro-Prussian War, where Bismarck engineered conflict with Austria over the same territories. But before the war, he actually isolated Austria diplomatically and secured alliances essentially from France and Russia, and ensured that no one will intervene. And the war just lasted 7 weeks. Prussia won this war decisively at the Battle of, again, apologies for my pronunciation, Königsgrad. And now I think here's the genius part. Instead of crushing Austria completely, Bismarck sort of let them off easily. And the reason for that was because he didn't want a revenge driven Austria, and also he wanted future stability. Moving on, we had the Franco Prussian War, where Bismarck sort of needed the German states like Bavaria to join. However, they were hesitant. So, what Bismarck did was that he manufactured a crisis with France using the Ems dispatch. And what this basically meant that France, like he edited a diplomatic message to insult France, and this sort of leaked to provoke outrage in France. And through that mechanism, France declared war, which was a big mistake because Germany sort of united against a common enemy, and obviously Prussia won. And in 1871, the German Empire was declared in the Palace of Versailles, and that location to me just seems pure disrespect and absolute psychological domination that followed, leading up to World War One, essentially. So, going back to Bismarck, his real politic in action was that his empire was built on not really no ideology or any moral consistency, but only results. I believe that Bismarck, his only goal was to like unite the German Empire and sort of fertilize their military prowess. So, with that being said, in terms of historical contribution, and in terms of where do you see Otto von Bismarck in terms of historical military prowess, or do you think that Bismarck was simply a military sort of aggressor? Mr. Rishan Ali, Mr. Shazib Karim, or would you like to add anything else to the
Um,
comment regarding Bismarck?
so I mean, militarily, it's sort of difficult to talk about Bismarck because he wasn't a commander. But in terms of the politics, behind the wars. I don't think there's anyone in history as politically savvy as Otto von Bismarck was. He, like you said, he manufactured the war against France. He fully played Austria. He also played the whole of Europe. Bismarck had Bismarck used to cut and make new relations with countries all the time. He was always, like you said, pragmatic, and that was, I think, what put him a cut above the rest. Because you have to remember that at this time, Austria-Hungary, I mean, it's a diminishing empire. Napoleon had battered them several times, while Prussia is this big up and coming power. But historically, Prussia is a relatively new country. Like, Prussia only started gaining legitimacy with Frederick the Great in the Seven Years' War, where they have a wonderful army, so they were able to hold off the Russians, the Austrians, as well as the French. But uh, in terms of the large scheme of history, Austria-Hungary had been around for a long time. The Holy Roman Empire, which was led by the King of Austria, was also around for a long time. You had the French neighboring them, and all these other German states. Prussia was one of the youngest, yet their military might put them at sort of the focal point of Germany at the time Bismarck became chancellor. But his use of Austria to sort of start uniting Germany, as well as using France as an opposition, the level of diplomacy to do that, I don't think there was any other political leader in history who had that. Like, Bismarck was able to unite Germany pretty much in under 5 years. Most of it was done in 1 year. And this is something which politicians all around Germany, the Bavarians, the Prussians several times, the Austrians, they've been failing to do this ever since Napoleon invaded. And even before that, the Holy Roman Empire was not a concrete empire, even. It was a more of a confederation of small kingdoms, which were mainly ruled by the Habsburgs, but it was incredibly dysfunctional, and different city states would always there was a lot of infighting. They weren't able to ever reclaim a lot of the land that they once had, and it was basically a constantly shrinking confederation rather than an actual holy empire. But what Bismarck was able to do, it completely transformed the whole scene in Europe. Bismarck captured land in Silesia, which belonged to Poland. Silesia was a sorry, that was Frederick William II, Frederick the Great. That also improved Prussia's industry, and with Bismarck capturing land in Bavaria, Brandenburg, Saxony, uh, it turned the new German Empire into an absolute industrial powerhouse with the incredible Prussian army, which had been around for several decades at this point and was one of the best armies in Europe. That incredible army is also what allowed Bismarck to crush the French and enter Paris in under a year, which has basically never been done before. I mean, except by Hitler. So, I mean, Bismarck's political genius, I don't think can be understated. As well as after unifying Germany, Bismarck was able to claim several important colonial possessions in Africa, like Namibia, Cameroon, Togo, as well as Pacific Islands. Those were ultimately lost by Frederick Wilhelm II in World War I. But in the time Germany had those, Germany was the third large was the they became the second largest industry in Europe in basically no time. And soon after they were reaching, like, exceeding British levels until obviously World War I, and then even in World War II, Hitler, based off of Bismarck's work, even though they had lost some land at this point and their colonial possessions, Bismarck's industrial uh, possessions that he took in 1871, that allowed the Nazis to build another industrial giant for the second time. So, I mean, Bismarck completely changed the entire scene in Europe and in the world.
Wow. No, I mean, Rishan, I mean, you have a lot of passion in your voice. I wholeheartedly agree.
Yeah, I love Bismarck.
Oh, yeah, and I think like to add more to add on to what you had said, I think um, like what you'd mentioned before, like Europe in the mid 1800s, and where Germany didn't even exist, where it's just a bunch of small fragmented states. There's like no real unity and no like strong central identity. And then Bismarck was the one who really unified them. And I think if you look back to his legacy, like we can talk about the way, like not only like the impacts that he had, like the significance, but also like the mannerisms and how he did it. Like in 1864, I believe, when he fought Denmark with Austria and took control of the two regions. I think this wasn't just about land, it was about setting up tension with Austria. And then in 1866, I think 2 years afterwards, he turned on Austria. And then I'm pretty sure it was a pretty easy win for them. And this saw Austria being knocked out of German affairs. And then I think 4 years after, in 1870s, was like Bismarck's most pivotal moments, right? Because that's when they had conflicts with France, I think, where and then where he began the war against France. And I think overall, what makes Bismarck different is because I think most leaders stop after winning power, but he focused on keeping it. And not only like winning power, he focused on keeping it as well. And that's why he introduced health insurance, pensions, and worker protections, which sounds pretty modern, right? But this in reality wasn't just generosity. It was a type of strategy, because he wanted to stop socialism from rising and keep workers loyal to the state. So overall, I think even his kind policies were simply about control. Would you agree with that, Rishan?
Yeah, I think so, but I mean, just because it's for control doesn't mean the people didn't feel the benefits. Because ultimately, the reason he
You gotta
was
look at
doing
the
these
intentions.
things
I'm talking about
was
the
to.
intentions. I see,
Sorry?
like, of course, like, and of course, like the households there in that time had a lot of benefits from his policies, but I'm just like stating his like intentions.
Yeah, I mean, um, his intentions ultimately were to make Germany the strongest state possible. And I wouldn't say it was certainly about power, because Bismarck walked away from power, sort of walked away. He was sort of kicked out as well. But Bismarck absolutely hated his king's son, Frederick William II. Once he came into power, he was messing everything up that Bismarck had built. He was ruining relations with Britain. He was parading around a large navy. He was scaring the British on purpose. And this is stuff Bismarck knew not to do. Like, Bismarck knew his peers incredibly well. Like, with the leak to Napoleon III's France, he knew how egotistical Napoleon was, and he knew how fragile the French ego was. So when he said that, he knew France would declare war on Germany, and he also knew that that was all he needed to do to unite the German people, because they were united against a common enemy. And this common enemy was also on good terms with Austria. So it also knocked Austria out of the competition for leading the United Germany. He was absolute genius. As well as, like I already mentioned, Bismarck didn't punish Austria hard in the Austro-Prussian War because he knew Austria would want revenge. He wanted to keep the relations with Austria, and that ultimately benefited Germany slightly. I mean, they were able to ally with Austria-Hungary in World War I. That didn't work out very well, but that was impossible for them to know because Austria had a large army and they were fragmented and not a bit fragile, but the relation was still there, and that was because Bismarck never fractured any relationships. So Bismarck, honestly, I think he wanted the best for Germany and he wanted to create the strongest German state possible. And I think he also knew that the way forward to do that was to keep himself in power. Because we saw what happened when Bismarck lost power. Germany went into World War I and ultimately lost all their colonial possessions, it lost a ton of land, and got treated harshly, incredibly harshly in the Treaty of Versailles. Ironically, in the same place where the German Empire was proclaimed. And then the World War I consequences ultimately caused the Nazis to gain power, leading to World War II. And then Germany lost even more land. All of East Prussia lost. So, I mean, yes, Bismarck did have ulterior motives to these policies, but it was the best for the German people.
Hmm. Interesting, Rishan. So that being said, I would like to ask you a question. Like, for the policies that Bismarck had in place, are any of these policies still prevalent in Germany's society in this day and age? Would you say?
I mean, a lot of the social reforms that Bismarck had put in place, such as a certain degree of social security and workers' rights and, industrial rights, they are in place. But I wouldn't say that specifically because of Bismarck. It's more of like a modern thing. But a lot of the work Bismarck had put into German society had been lost because of Frederick Wilhelm II and Adolf Hitler, because of their stupid decisions, their erratic wars. It really hindered Germany because imagine a situation where Frederick Wilhelm II listened to Bismarck, kept relations well with France, and was pragmatic about his relationships with Austria and Serbia as well as Russia. The whole fabric of the world will look completely different. World War I probably, and war there would have been a great war, but Germany would likely have not been the victim and suffered. And that difference is the difference between World War I and II. And World War II, as I'm sure we all know, completely changed obviously Germany a lot, but also the whole world. So I don't think it can be understated that uh, Bismarck's influence was massive, but a lot of it was erased by his later successors.
Hmm, that's very interesting, Rishan. I think adding on to you, I would say, like from a global politics perspective, like me and I take, I take global politics. I wanted to, but I think like Bismarck is a perfect example of realism because he prioritizes state power, stability, and control over ideals like democracy or participation. And I think war, diplomacy, welfare, it's all just tools to strengthen the state. So I think in a way, Bismarck didn't just unify Germany, he kind of engineered it. And I think, like, I kind of mentioned this before, like, It just makes me wonder, like, was he a nation builder or was he just a master manipulator? Like, because like on one hand he did create a powerful unified Germany that shaped European history for decades, but on the other hand he did it through calculated conflict, political manipulation, and tight control over society. And like I think if you were to ask me this question, I would say it's probably a bit of both, because I think Bismarck shows us that sometimes the most effective leaders aren't the ones with the best ideals. I think they're just ones that I think they're the ones who kind of understand power the best, you know?
Look, I think manipulation is just a part of diplomacy. It's a part of politics. Every good politician has to be manipulative to a certain degree. Um,
I think like
Bismarck.
the best institutions. I think like you have to be transparent. Like I'm sorry to interrupt, but I think I don't know. I don't know about this take, Rishan, because I think transparency is the key to having a successful government. And we can see
Okay.
in the fall of
Sorry.
Sheikh Hasina.
Okay. Yeah. Finish.
Because like in like for example, the Sheikh Hasina's government in 2024 summer wasn't fully transparent with its citizens, and which led to the fall of the regime. So I think transparency is key instead of manipulation.
I think first thing we need to consider is the time. So this is the time in Europe where France is a monarchy under Napoleon III. Britain is a parliamentary monarchy. Germany is a parliamentary monarchy to a degree. Bismarck was sort of a dictator, but he also had the king above him. Austro-Hungary monarchy, Russia monarchy. Europe was surrounded by monarchies. I mean, Italy had just formed under Emmanuel III. Similar to Germany, they had just unified, but you can't compare that with a world today in which most countries follow a democratic institution. Bangladesh is meant to have followed a democratic institution at the time of Sheikh Hasina. But also another thing is I agree transparency is a good quality in a leader, but I think with Bismarck, he's just an exception. He is so exceptionally um just like he is not like any other political leader in his intentions. He purely wanted a strong, unified, capable Germany. And that is exactly what he achieved. He would not have been able to achieve that had he been transparent. He would have not been able to unify the German states. But had he not, Germany would have never been the industrial powerhouse it is today. So, I mean, you can say that he wasn't transparent, but I don't think you can say that's a negative for Bismarck specifically, just because of how he, just because of how he was, the things that he did, he would not have been able to do had he been transparent. And if you take a utilitarian perspective, Bismarck was right in doing so. It worked out for the greater good. So I mean, I would defend Bismarck on that front, but I do agree. In general, political leaders need to be transparent, especially in today's age, where if you're not transparent, like what happened with Sheikh Hasina, you can't hold power.
I see. I see where you're coming from, Rishan. Now I'm in agreement with you. Thank you. Thank you for your insights.
Thank you for all the discussions. I wholeheartedly agree with the discussions pertaining Otto von Bismarck. So moving on to our next big brother. One thing that I think we can unanimously agree on pertaining Bismarck was that Bismarck was calculated and controlled. So now I think it's time to move on to the raw ideological power. So Mao Zedong rose in China that was essentially not just divided but humiliated and sort of stripped down. By the early 20th century, China had endured decades of internal rebellion, economic stagnation, and foreign domination at the hands of the Western powers, and notably Japan. The Qing dynasty had collapsed, but what replaced it was not stability but fragmentation. We saw warlords control regions, the economy was weak, and the state was virtually non existent. And unlike Bismarck's Germany, which lacked unity, Mao's China lacked order itself. In this environment, the promise of total transformation became not just appealing but necessary. And during this time, Mao emerged as the leader of the Chinese Communist Party during a prolonged civil war with the nationalists. And those nationalists essentially then moved on to the small island nation of Taiwan. So what sets Mao apart is not just his revolutionary zeal, but his ability to mobilize the rural population. While traditional sort of Marxism focuses on the urban working class, the proletariat, Mao adapts it to sort of China's reality by placing it on the peasants at the center of the revolution. And this shift is critical because the peasants allowed him to build a massive support base and ultimately defeat the nationalists in 1949, establishing the People's Republic of China. And the nationalists, they became Taiwan or the Republic of China, ROC. And from the beginning, Mao did not see the state as a neutral institution. For him, the state is a tool to reshape society entirely, politically, economically, and even culturally. So once in power, and I think this is sort of what historians agree with, and I personally think that Chairman Mao was undeniably a dictator, and just like all dictators, he did not allow freedom of speech, neither nor the press in a capacity which was not under surveillance. So therefore, Chairman Mao was essentially a dictator to say the least. And Dollar Dialogue does not sponsor dictators, nor do we condone their actions. So therefore, I would like to say that Chairman Mao, dictator, sort of was painful for China because, first of all, Mao implemented a centrally planned economy, eliminating private ownership and placing all major economic divisions in the hands of the state. In economic terms, this is essentially suicide because no economy in the world today has performed adequately or succeeded with the centrally planned economy because it sort of disincentivizes the factors of production of the economy to be used to their fullest because when people do not have if or because it is human nature for all of us to succeed, so if all of us have the same goods, we sort of lack the motivation to work harder. So therefore, we saw that land was redistributed, then rapidly collectivized as individual farms are were absorbed into large communes, and essentially the absence of market meant that production did not respond to the real demand in economic terms, but also to a great extent to the political expectations. And this became painfully clear during the Great Leap Forward, which was launched in 1958. Mao's ambition to transform China from an agrarian society to an industrial superpower almost overnight. Communes were expanded, peasants were forced to abandon traditional farming practices, and millions were redirected towards the steel production in the backyard furnaces. Local officials, under pressure to meet unrealistic targets, often began falsifying production data. As a result, we saw the central government believing these inflated reports extract even more grain from rural areas, leaving the peasants with little to survive on. And what follows is one of the deadliest famines in human history, with tens of millions of deaths. And this strategy is not simply a result of bad luck, but of systemic failure, as well as the mechanisms of the free market not working. And from an economic standpoint, obviously, Mao's China represents the extreme end of state intervention, which clearly did not work. However, I would say that what distinguishes Mao from Bismarck is not just the state of control, but his nature, his complete lack and disregard for sort of egoistic nature, which sort of led to the Great Leap Forward, essentially, in some aspects, failing to a great extent. So, therefore, where Bismarck sort of adapted to reality, I would say that Mao attempted to reshape reality itself, and it clearly didn't work out. So, with that being said, is there any opinions pertaining the information being shared, or would you like to add any new information pertaining Chairman Mr. Shazib Karim, Mr. Rishan Ali, or Mr. Supin Nagala?
Yeah, I think you're completely right. When it comes to comparing Bismarck and Mao, there are certainly some similarities. They were both unifying factors of these nations, whereas Germany had never been properly unified into a nation state, whereas Mao, I mean, prior to 1911, the Qing dynasty had a unified China, but the Kuomintang completely failed to fill the power vacuum. Sun Yat sen died quite quickly, and then Chiang Kai shek. He required the CCP's help in the United Front to defeat the warlords, and I mean, he sort of succeeded, but he didn't fully unite China as it had been under the Qing dynasty. Then in 27, they started attacking the CCP, and then once the Japanese invaded, they had to go back to the CCP and ask them for help to defeat the Japanese, which they completely failed anyways. But I mean, Japan lost World War II, so that worked out for the KMT. But then the KMT were still unable to consolidate their power. They were unable to unite China, and ultimately they lost the Chinese Civil War to a sort of like to a guerrilla group, which ultimately became a large uh, conventional army, largely thanks to the work of Mao as well as help from the Soviets. Um, but Mao and Bismarck are very different in terms of their political prowess. Like you mentioned, Bismarck was an incredibly pragmatic leader, and I think um, your explanation as you saying that Bismarck was used reality rather than Mao trying to warp reality. I think that's absolutely spot on. Um, but I think the biggest thing Mao did for China, I mean, obviously, like you mentioned, there's the Great Famine, Cultural Revolution were absolutely disastrous and horrible for China. But Mao's mobilization of the peasants, unification of China, ultimately allowed China to become the state that it is today. So I mean, I think the Mao has to also be his work has to also be appreciated to an extent. We can't just sit here and criticize him all day. But I think like uh, he's nothing like Bismarck in terms of his political ability. He was able to keep power for his life, even at times when it got shaky, such as the Great Famine. The CCP were slowly getting skeptical of him. Cultural Revolution really helped him consolidate power, but he wasn't like Bismarck. Bismarck was able to consolidate power through his work rather than through techniques of terror and destruction, which I think is what really sets uh, Bismarck apart from many of these other dictators. He was he was a sort of, I mean, I wouldn't want to say good because I don't think they can be political leaders can be inherently good or bad. They're always going to be selfish and have negative qualities to a degree. But Bismarck ultimately did work for the greatest good, whereas Mao worked for his best good. People can argue that Mao had a vision that he was trying to achieve, but I mean, it's undeniable that the Great Famine was completely manufactured and completely avoidable. It's undeniable that the CCP had set killing quotas on villages for the cadres that they had to meet, which meant killing unnecessary amounts of people. He also destroyed Chinese birth rates. So there were tons of negative qualities about Mao, but ultimately, him being a unifying factor completely changed China and allowed it to become the country it is today because the Kuomintang didn't have that capability that Mao did. They were they really appealed to the urban classes and the petite bourgeoisie, so it was a small part of China. They didn't have the peasant support, which was 85% of China's population at the time. They would have never been able to unify China as the CCP were able to do. And I think the, a China under the KMT would have been pretty much like an ancient China in terms of their size. outside the East Coast. I don't think they would be able to consolidate power. China would remain fragmented under warlords for a much longer time, and they would not have been able to unify, as well as the KMT having questionable social policies. I mean, when they were leaders, they were quite they were dictators. Chiang Kai-shek was a dictator. Martial law in Taiwan lasted until 1972. Um, and Chiang Kai-shek, when he was leader of China, he led the White Terror against the CCP, where he kicked them out of his own party, unprovoked, just purely to consolidate power, which ultimately ended up being a fatal mistake since he lost the Chinese Civil War. But um, Chiang Kai-shek, it's obviously hard to tell. It's hard to guess how history would play out, but Chiang Kai shek would not have been a much better alternative. Far less people would have died, but in the long term for China, I doubt they would have been able to be the powerhouse they are today had the KMT won the Chinese Civil War. So I think Mao's accomplishments need to also be appreciated.
Thank you, Dolph. And also pertaining Chairman Mao, I was wondering, would you say China's recent rise economically in the global scale, would you say it's more of Chairman Mao's contribution, or would you say it was Deng Xiaoping who sort of liberalized the Chinese economy?
I think I have to give like 90% of the credit to Deng Xiaoping. Um, fully economically, he transformed China. China would not have been the country they are today without him, but he would have not been able to transform China economically had Mao not united China. Um, I mean, Mao knew how dangerous Deng Xiaoping was because of his ideas. He suppressed him. He kept him at weaker positions than he was capable of having. So he was very aware of the threat Deng Xiaoping posed to Mao's vision of China. But I think, yeah, Deng Xiaoping completely transformed China economically. It's just the fact that Mao was able to unite China, which really no one else would have been able to do. Like, Mao had led the CCP through the Long March, which did lose 70% of their troops, but they were able to spread their ideas throughout the peasants. And Mao's transformation of the Marxist Leninist ideology into a Maoist ideology focused around the peasants completely transformed the CCP's popularity and capability to take control of China. Like I mentioned earlier, 85% are peasants. So when you appeal to the peasants, like the land reform, shortly after taking power in 1950, they put in charge the land reforms. They persecuted landlords, which was horrible. I mean, public persecutions, public killings, but these landlords had also been persecuting and treating peasants horribly for hundreds of years. So Mao did have a lot of important social changes that allowed the CCP to gain popularity and gain power and consolidate that power. And Deng Xiaoping inherited a relatively stable China, a China that had been more stable than it had been basically since the heydays of the Qing dynasty, which were hundreds of years ago, 200 years ago. So, I mean, Mao's help to Deng Xiaoping cannot be understated, but um, Deng Xiaoping economically transformed China. So if you look at it from an economic standpoint, I think you have to give credit to Deng Xiaoping. But from a historical standpoint and the Deng Xiaoping's ability to do what he did, the credit has to go to Mao, in my opinion.
Thank you, Dov. So, from what you're saying, you're essentially implying that in order for our economy to grow, and this was sort of explored in earlier dollar dialogue episodes as well, like with Park Chung in South Korea, or even Lee Kuan Yew in Singapore, or currently in Burkina Faso with Ibrahim Traore as well to some extent. In order for a developing country where corruption is prevalent and where it's sort of not unified, we sort of need governance structure of more state capitalism rather than democracy. Is that what you're saying, Dov?
I know that's not what I'm saying. I'm saying that like, are you referring to my claim that the KMT would have been unable to unify China?
Yeah, and the Deng Xiaoping, like he was sort of been successful due to Mao's unified China.
I think it's much more nuanced than that. You have to think about the political state of China and the social state of China. Because China, I mean, this is the 20th century, but China was basically living in the 18th century. The Qing dynasty was very outdated. They were completely unable to modernize. Ever since the Opium Wars in the mid 1800s, the Qing dynasty was a weakened giant, basically. The European powers were constantly exploiting them. They created the city of Shanghai, where basically they had tiny colonies. And this imperialism also really helped the support of the CCP. Um, KMT also tried appealing to that, but they were unable to because they ultimately did have to publicly rely on imperial powers' help. So I think there's many factors that are um, prevalent in China, which are not usually prevalent in many other places. So, I think the appeal of Maoist communism to the Chinese people greatly allowed the CCP to gain their power. And Chiang Kai shek was sort of a bad leader. I mean, he was unable to defeat the warlords completely. He was unable to take control of Tibet. He was unable to take control of East Turkestan, which there now is known as Xinjiang. He was unable to defeat the Japanese. He was unable to defeat the communists. He was basically inept. I mean, Sun Yat sen believed in him, but he did not live up to Sun Yat sen's legacy at all. And he also failed to live up to the Chinese legacy. The Chinese referred to this time period as the 100 years of humiliation after the Opium Wars until the CCP took power. So I think you don't need a strong or dictatorial state to gain power or to unify a country. But in the specific instances of China where it's the CCP against the KMT, Chiang Kai shek against Mao, Mao was inevitably the only one in that situation who would be able to unify China. Deng Xiaoping obviously didn't have the power at this point, so he's unable to say what he would be able to do. But he didn't have um, he didn't have the peasant background that Mao did. He didn't understand the Chinese society like Mao did, which is why Mao was able to create this incredibly hyper focused version of communism relevant to China. I mean, then the arguments of his economic ineptitude definitely are valid. I think Mao's vision of China is completely unrealistic, but just because it's unrealistic doesn't mean that the peasants wouldn't be appealed to it. It attracted the masses and it worked to get Mao into power. It didn't work ultimately in the way Mao had wanted it to, and Deng Xiaoping ultimately reversed that and fixed it. But the unification and the mobilization of the peasants, there are not many men out there who could do that, like Mao did. And definitely not Chiang Kai shek.
Thank you, Mr. Rishan Ali, for that opinion, and I wholeheartedly agree with what you have said so far regarding Mao. So, moving on to the last dictator for today, we have Mr. Kamal Atatürk. So, Mr. Mustafa Kamal Atatürk also emerged in a moment of collapse. However, not unlike Mao, but with a completely different response. So, at the end of the World War One, the Ottoman Empire, once one of the most powerful empires in the world, was effectively dismantled. Its territories were occupied. Its economy was essentially shattered, and its identity was in a crisis. Foreign powers sort of carved up its land, and what remains of Anatolia faces the very real possibility of the permanent subjugation at that period. So where Mao rose from fragmentation and revolution, Ataturk rose from defeat and humiliation. But instead of mobilizing chaos, he imposed order. Ataturk led the Turkish War of Independence, successfully pushing out occupying forces and abolishing the Ottoman Sultanate. And in 1923, he established the Republic of Turkey, which is now known as Turkiye, not as a continuation of the empire, but as a complete break from it. From the beginning, his vision was clear. Turkey must modernize, secularize, and align itself with the West if it is to survive. And unlike Mao, who looks inward to reshape society through ideology, Ataturk looked forward, borrowing institutions, laws, and cultural norms from Europe. If I'm not mistaken, one of his most civil reform was the fact that women could not wear hijab or burqa and men had to be clean shaven. So these kind of reform are not just like culturally different from like the Ottoman who were sort of Islamic, but Atatürk wanted to align Turkey, the new modern Turkey, with Europe. And economically, he adopted was what was in between capitalism and socialism, and this definitely led to industrialization and investing in infrastructure. It guided Turkey towards a positive new direction. However, unlike Mao's command economy, private enterprise was not completely eliminated. The government still acted as a coordinator, stepping in where markets were weak, and this sort of state capitalism worked brilliantly for Turkey. However, what distinguishes Atatürk from both Bismarck and Mao was the position that he was in. Bismarck used to use the state strategically, balancing control with calculated concessions like welfare. Mao pushed the state to control to its extreme, attempting to reshape every aspect of society. Atatürk, in contrast, used the state as a tool for modernization. So with now that we have seen all three, Bismarck who used power strategically, Mao who pushed control to its extreme, and Atatürk who tried to engineer modernization from the top down. My question to Mr. Rishan, Mr. Shazkarim, or Mr. Subir Nagala, who seems to have internet difficulties today, in your opinion, what kind of state do you think actually works best? Bismarck state, Mao state, or Atatürk state?
Um, I think in general, Atatürk state is the most applicable to countries, especially in the modern day. I think, I mean, Bismarck obviously is a different time period, but I think Bismarck's state only worked because Bismarck was the man leading it. We saw that when you have less able leaders leading that German state, like Frederick Wilhelm II, it's very dangerous because you have this giant power, but you you are you feel like you deserve more power than you have because you have France with all their colonial possessions, you have Britain with the largest empire in history and the greatest navy in history. So these insecurities that Frederick William II felt, Bismarck didn't. Bismarck was completely pragmatic. And when you have a leader like that, that is when you can have a fully functional and um, well-oiled machine of a dictator, a, a nation led by a dictator. So I think if you have someone like Bismarck, which is incredibly rare, I mean, there is no one like Bismarck except himself. Bismarck state can work, but if you have anyone else at the helm, I think Atatürk state is the most applicable. I mean, I haven't mentioned Mao because Mao state doesn't work. We saw that with Mao. I mean, the others faced a lot of success, but Mao, pretty much everything he did, except the Chinese Civil War and the unification of China, everything else failed. So I think it would be Ataturk in most cases, but if you take each individual state rather than their systems and their policies, I think Bismarck's Germany was the most successful.
Thank you, Rishan. And as we are closing in for the podcast for today and running a bit low on time, I one last question to you would be to you, Rishan Ali. For me, would be based on current day where we see economic uncertainty and like political uncertainty arising from the Western powers and from the Eastern powers. Would you say these are sort of reflection of history in some aspects? Because prior to the podcast, you said that we must learn history in order to not repeat it.
Yeah, I mean, these trends are very, very prevalent. I mean, Iran today is a product of one single assassination, in my opinion. The replacement of Mossadegh with the Shah of Iran, Shah Pahlavi, I think ruined Iran because, I mean, in today's world, so many Iranians try looking at the Shah's version of Iran and romanticize it, but I think that's just a modern revisionist perspective. The Shah had his own secret police. He was a complete dictator, one of the most corrupt leaders in the world at the time. He completely undervalued Iran's oil and natural gas reserves. He did not work for the best of Iran. He was a he had many social benefits. Sorry, he had many social policies that had benefited the Iranian people, and he was a stable figure. But I mean, the Islamic Revolution just proves that he was unpopular. You cannot uh, assassinate a popular leader like Mossadegh, democratically elected leader, and place a dictator instead of him. So, I mean, this ultimate conflict that we're seeing with Iran is unavoidable because when you have when you replace an unpopular leader, sorry, when you replace a popular leader with an unpopular leader, even if that leader has supporters, doesn't mean they should be in power. And then you have the Islamic regime, which is another undeniable result because when you try and erase a certain degree of national identity, like the Shah tried, he tried to westernize Iran too much. He sort of changed the cultural fabric of Iran. When that happens, there's a massive 360, and then there's another cultural reversion of Islam because the cultural reversion of Iran because Islam was never a massive force in Persia like it was in the Islamic Revolution. Historically, Persia had always been much more liberal with their um, Islamic views. They didn't see themselves as part of the Arab state even after Khalid had conquered the Sasanian Empire. So, I mean, uh, I think there are many historical trends that we can notice in Iran, and having studied history, I think many people could have seen this coming.
Thank you, Mr. Rishan Ali. I wholeheartedly agree with what you have said so far. History is definitely paramount for society to understand our mistakes and to grow forward. So, viewers, as we step back from Mao, Atatürk, and Bismarck, what becomes clear through today's episode and conversation was the fact that none of these leaders simply governed their countries. They redefined what the state could be. Each one of them operated in moments of crisis where traditional systems had failed and the future was uncertain. And in those moments, they made the same fundamental choice to concentrate power in the hands of the state and use it as a primary engine of transformation. But what they did with that power and the consequences that follow diverged dramatically. So, what do these three leaders teach us? Firstly, I would say it's that strong states can definitely accelerate development. However, that must not come entirely at the cost of freedom of citizens. And secondly, we also looked at how power without limit sort of carries risk over time. The same centralized authority that enable rapid transformation can also suppress feedback, silence opposition, and allow mistakes to scale into disaster, whether it's famine in Mao's China, repression in Bismarck's Germany, or cultural tensions in Atatürk's Turkey. The cost of concentrated power are always present, sometimes immediately, sometimes decades later. And that brings us to the present. For countries today, especially developing ones like Bangladesh, the question is not whether state should be strong, but how that strength should be used and constrained. Too little state involvement can lead to inequality, underinvestment, and market failure. Too much can lead to inefficiency, corruption, and loss of freedom. Ultimately, the stories of Mao, Atatürk, and Bismarck are not just historical case studies, viewers, but they are warnings and lessons. They remind us that building a nation is not just about growth or power, but about balance, restraint, and long-term vision. Because everything in the end, the most successful states are not the ones that control everything, but the ones that know what not to control. So with that being said, Mr. Rishan Ali, thank you for joining for today's podcast. And is there any final words that you would like to say before we depart the podcast, before we depart our penultimate podcast, and me, you, and Shazib's last sessions together in Dollar Dialogue?
I just want to say thank you for having me on for the last time. I've enjoyed every single time I've come on here, and I'll really miss having these conversations with you guys. I really enjoy it.
Yeah, and I think to have my final words as well. All right, it's been a it's been a journey. All right, we've been doing this for 3 years now, and then Rishan's been penultimate. Yeah, it is the penultimate episode, but we have been doing this for 3 years now. The end is coming, and on this sort of final one with Rishan Ali, I think he was one of our first speakers, and now he's one of our last. Like, it's making me emotional, man. No, we've been through a lot, right, together.
Yes,
Yeah, I'll
Mr.
miss
Shazib,
it.
it's been a ride. Mr. Rishan Ali, are you
I,
feeling sentimental as well?
I think I'm tearing up a bit. I'm sorry, I'm tearing up a bit.
Yeah, me too.
Thank you, viewers. And as we close this sentimental episode of Dollar Dialogue, stay tuned for the next episode, which I believe is episode 64, if I'm not mistaken, with the new host of Dollar Dialogue, where me and Shazib will retire from the podcast. Thank you, viewers, for listening today's episode, and stay tuned for another episode next week with another very interesting guest speakers.